Welcome to Tune In Tuesday, Old Testament History, Chapter 4, Session 07a, The Kingdom and the Prophets, the Split Kingdom, Part 1. I know that's a long title, but it pretty much says it all. David and Solomon had made quite a mark on the kingdom. It's remarkable what men and women who have the Spirit of God and who walk in righteousness can do, especially when they have free reign. Beyond that, because of God's involvement, much more than what the men who were kings planned and anticipated could be accomplished. And that is what happened with Jerusalem. A righteous undercurrent was set in motion, centered around the temple and the prophets, which continued to function into the future as the conscience of the nation, which encouraged the kings when they ruled righteously and reproved them when they did not. We can see this in the fact that the kings of Judah alternated in doing that which was right in the eyes of the Lord or did evil in his sight. The spiritual battles behind the scenes at this nexus of human power were still raging. The intrigues of the royal court grew and waned. It was like the proverbial algebra problem of the frog climbing out of the well. Every day he climbs up 3 feet, and every night he slips back 2. The good kings brought the day, the evil, the night. And the frog? Well, the poor frog was confused. Had the kings continued doing that which was right in God's sight, world history might be very different. Who knows how the world could have been blessed? We'll just have to wait until the millennial kingdom to see that. David did a lot despite his falterings. Solomon's first half built upon David's successes, but the second half of Solomon's reign didn't go so well. You heard what 1 Kings 11:16 said. 1 Kings 11:16, and Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord. Oh no. And went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. Wow. Well, why did that happen? Because Solomon catered to his unbelieving wives who had been married to seal alliances with foreign nations. They were considered tokens of friendship. No king would attack a country where his daughter was living as a princess. 1 Kings chapter 9 records how far these connections went. 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 15. And this is the reason of the levy which King Solomon raised for to build the house of the Lord and his own house, and Millo, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, and Megiddo, and Gezer. For Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and taken Gezer, and burnt it with fire, and slain the Canaanites that dwelt in the city, and given it for a present, for a dowry, unto his daughter Solomon's wife. And Solomon built Gezer, and Beth-horon, the nether, or the lower. See, Gezer and Beth-horon were forts that were built to protect the approaches to Jerusalem. Gezer was not an old folks' home. It was a fortress. Having Egypt as a friendly nation to the south was thought to be important for Israel, and vice versa, having Israel as a buffer state between Egypt and its enemies to the north was desirable for Egypt. But these were beneficial only from a worldly standpoint, because if Israel had stayed righteous, God would have fought for them like he did for Joshua, with earthquakes, meteors, storms, and hornets, and even the sun and the moon. With those, Who needs alliances? But unfortunately, worldly royal logic prevailed, and with it came worldly consequences. Another modern idea is that one would think that Solomon in all his wisdom would have convinced those wives to convert to Judaism. In fact, the Talmud claims this to try to excuse Solomon. They say the wives did convert, but it wasn't sincere. That sounds like shifting some blame to me, but I don't believe it. Remember, the same guys that did the same tricks to hide Moses' grandson from us and minimize David's sin with Bathsheba, all right, they did the same thing with this to try to say, well, the wives converted, but they weren't sincere. Religion was closely tied to the affairs of state. It was very important to them. Church and state were not separated back then like today. So conversion was not permitted under the customs of their treaty. How Solomon treated the daughters of foreign kings reflected upon the status of his nation's foreign relations with them. Forcing them to convert would be viewed as a form of abuse. Look at 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 11. 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 11 is a very telling comment about this very thing. And Solomon brought up the daughter of Pharaoh out of the city of David unto the house that he had built for her. For he said, My wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places are holy, whereunto the ark of the Lord hath come. Now, why would he have done that unless there was something unholy about her? So, she didn't even stay in the same house as Solomon. He stayed in his father David's house till his own was built. Well, even speaking in modern terms, if Solomon wanted to maintain their quote-unquote most favored nation status, he'd have to lavish attention on all the alliance wives equally. So Solomon built pagan temples for them. He even worshipped in them with his wives. That's a big no-no. Even if Solomon was doing it just for ceremony and show, it was forbidden. Do you remember what Moses and Joshua repeated in Deuteronomy and the book of Joshua? Do not worship false gods. That is the number one thing that God won't permit. And they were repeatedly warned, do that at your peril. On the other hand, we see a vivid portrayal of the surpassing greatness of our God in his favor for man in the wisdom imparted to Solomon. I think that if you look at it from this perspective, you'll realize something about the tip of that iceberg. Solomon's experience in wisdom and knowledge was a mere taste of the bliss awaiting the faithful in the hereafter. Hello, infinity. Israel looked forward to having the law written in their hearts, not needing for it to be taught to them. We anticipate that, as knowing as we are known, comprehending the incomprehensible, knowing the love of Christ which passes knowledge, and Solomon experienced a mere taste. Oh, had he not fallen, where would we be today? Just as the spiritual battle in the unseen dimensions had bled over into the physical, into the wilderness, it raged in Jerusalem. Just more subtle and crafty, manifested in the intrigues of the royal court and the seductions of the royal bedroom. But Solomon did not fall all at once. It had to be a seesaw battle, as we've seen with Saul and others. So we just can't compromise. Oh, it won't matter just this once. Well, when is it just this once? The more we compromise, the easier it becomes. But there always will be a godly solution to the seemingly unsolvable circumstances presented to us by the adversary, continually herding us towards his objectives, trapping us in his predicaments, trying to get us to compromise. Remember the lesson of the Old Testament that we began this class with? Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10 again. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11. Now, all these things happened unto them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world, the age, are come. Wherefore, let him that thinks that he stands on his own take heed lest he fall. Verse 13. This is gold. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted above that which you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. Wherefore, as practical application, being able to stand up to all temptations. Verse 14. Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. You see, idolatry is the adversary's ultimate goal. Therefore, each temptation is a step in that direction. The adversary is satisfied with small steps, knowing he'll be back again to try to extract more compromises. But knowing that, let's take this further and understand the point that Paul was making there in Corinthians. Verse 15. I speak as to wise men. Judge ye what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? What he accomplished by his death, the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, being many, are one bread and one body, for we are all partakers of that one bread. Verse 18, Behold Israel after the flesh. Are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? So, just like those who participated in an offering got to eat of the meat of the sacrifice, we eat of communion, which is a representation of Christ's sacrifice. Wow, have you ever put that together? We internalize it. We live by it. And just as they walked away from the tabernacle or temple forgiven, so do we. You know what? Holy Week is 2 weeks from now. Think about that when you receive communion. I'm going to ask Ray to repost the link of the MP3 teaching of my 2020 communion service. I'll ask him to put that back up on Way Beyond. The PDF for it is in the files section of Way Beyond, and it's titled A 2020 View of Communion. Also, the file section even still has some of those simple bread recipes. You remember the bread shortage in 2020 when we had that communion? But now, because of what we are learning from the Old Testament, I trust that that experience will even be deeper and more profound and life-changing. You know, it's supposed to be like that. We're not only supposed to walk away forgiven, we're supposed to be healed too. We're supposed to be whole in every way. Well, hallelujah, sock it to you. I'm looking forward to that. Verse 19, 1 Corinthians 10:19. What say I then? That the idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifices to idols is anything? But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. And I would not that you should have fellowship with devils. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and of the table of devils. Verse 22. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? What's that mean? Are we stronger than He? Do you remember what it means to provoke the Lord to jealousy? Let's go look at it. Deuteronomy chapter 29. Thinking in terms of temptation. Temptation is a small step towards idolatry. That's the adversary's major goal. Deuteronomy 29:29. Keep therefore the words of this covenant, Moses told them, and do them, keep and do, that you may prosper in all that you do. And that's the key. Just keep and do. You stand this day, all of you, Moses said to them, before the Lord your God, your captains of your tribes, your elders, your officers, with all the men of Israel, your little ones, your wives, and your stranger that's in your camp, from the hewer of your wood down unto the drawer of thy water, that thou shouldest enter into a covenant with the Lord thy God, and into his oath, which the Lord thy God maketh with thee this day, that he may establish to thee today for a people unto himself, that he may be unto you a God, as he hath said unto thee, and as he hath sworn unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Neither with you only do I make this covenant and with this oath, but with him that stands here with us this day before the Lord our God, and also with him that is not here with us this day. For you know how we have dwelt in the land of Egypt, and how we came through the nations which you passed by, and you've seen their abominations, and their idols, wood and stone, silver and gold, which were among them. Verse 18. Lest there should be among you man or woman or family or tribe whose hearts turn away this day from the Lord our God and go and serve the gods of these nations, lest there should be among you a root that bears gall and wormwood. So don't go down that road. Don't even take a step. And it shall come to pass, though, if they do go down that road, when they hear the words of this curse, that he bless himself in his heart and say, I'll have peace, though I walk in the imagination of mine heart to add drunkenness to thirst. Oh, it won't matter. I'll have peace. Well, you saw what mattered. Verse 20, the Lord will not spare him, but then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy shall smoke against that man, and all the curses that are written in this book shall lie upon him, and the Lord shall blot out his name from under heaven. So that is provoking the Lord to jealousy. Verse 21, and the Lord shall separate him unto evil out of all the tribes of Israel, according to all the curses of the covenant that are written in this book of the law, so that the generation to come of your children that shall rise up after you, and the stranger that shall come from a far land, shall say, when they see the plagues of the land, and of the sicknesses which the Lord hath laid upon it, and that the whole land therefore is brimstone and salt and burning, that it is not sown, nor beareth, nor has any grass growing therein, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and his wrath? Even all nations shall say, wherefore hath the Lord done this unto the land? What means the heat of his great anger? Then men shall say, because they have forsaken the covenant of the Lord, God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them forth out of the land of Egypt. For they went and served other gods, and worshipped them, gods whom they knew not, and whom he had not given unto them. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against this land, to bring it upon it all the curses that are written in this book. And the Lord rooted them out of their land in anger and in wrath and in great indignation, and cast them into another land, as it is this day. Well, that ultimately happened. The temple that Solomon had just built, with all its gold and splendor, would be destroyed, and the people carried away into a foreign land. Didn't happen all at once. It too was a seesaw battle. But ultimately, the adversary took them down, and the number one cause was idolatry. It was during the cycles of this ebb and flow of Solomon that he wrote the Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes. I'll briefly mention the Song of Solomon because I think Bullinger's treatment of the book is sufficient. I will give you a PDF on the Song of Solomon and way beyond, but I will share a quote with you from Bullinger's notes in the Companion Bible about the Song of Solomon. Quote, from the most ancient times, it has formed part of the Hebrew canonical scriptures. It is a poem based upon the true facts of a story which unfolds itself as it proceeds. Various interpretations have been given of it, the literal, the allegorical, and the typical. The allegorical embraced Jehovah and Israel, which was the view of the Jewish commentators. The Roman Catholics view it of the Virgin Mary, and the Protestant commentators view it of Christ and the Church. The typical view regards it as a type of Solomon's nuptials, or as that of Christ and the Gentiles. The allegorical view puts the coarse flatteries and language of a seducer into the lips of Christ, which is inconsistent with his dignity and holiness. It is the language of seduction put into the mouth of him who spake as never man spake. The number of speakers forbids all the interpretations which depend upon there being only two. There are 7 speakers in all, and they can be easily distinguished by the structures. That is, the Shulamite is the first speaker, the daughters of Jerusalem the second, Solomon the third. The fourth speaker is the shepherd lover of the Shunammite. Number 5, the brothers of the Shulamite. Number 6, the companions of the shepherd. And number 7, the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So that's a little bit about the Song of Solomon. Now, in the remaining part of tonight, my first session here, I'm going to summarize the book of Ecclesiastes. Of those scholars who think Solomon wrote it, which of course verse 1 says so, many think that he wrote it in his latter years. For example, the sections of Proverbs, I think, were written by Solomon in his first half of his reign. But I think that in the light of the fact that the latter half of his reign went downhill, and that it did so in a seesaw fashion, I think that explains the somber tone of Ecclesiastes. Solomon couldn't help but know that he had not stayed faithful to his promises to God, who appeared to him twice. God confronted him and told him the kingdom would be split. Upon hearing that, wouldn't you be pessimistic, realizing that all your hard work now would go to another? That idea actually arises several times in the book. So I think that supports that Solomon wrote this at one of the high points in the ebb and flow seesaw battle that transpired in his latter years. When one considers humanity or even the whole world, we are a mere spark in the wind of eternity. We are as grass that grows and flowers and then withers and dies, and where it was, remembereth it no more. Is there even a light at the end of that tunnel? That's depressing. Is that all there is? Is that all there is, my friend? That idea certainly does arise in the book of Ecclesiastes. For example, chapter 1, verse 8. He says, all things are full of labor, man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. The thing that is seen is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. Kind of a defeatist idea, isn't it? Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old time which was before us. There is no remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come, that shall come after. Is that all there is? No. There is far more to this jewel called Ecclesiastes. It's a book of wisdom. It is so high. It is so deep. Who can figure it out? Well, gee whiz, that's my job tonight. How do we analyze a book like this? Do we look at it subjectively and talk about the things that it inspires in us? Well, that's one way to look at it. Or do we look at it objectively and try to see its patterns and inductively reason from them what Solomon's intent was? Well, how does one do the latter? Yep, that's right. One looks for the repetitions around which ancient writings were structured. And they are present here, and they reveal the beauty of this book. Modern folks who do not know about repetitions will miss the point. So, the phrase, under the sun, that's an unusual phrase, isn't it? It occurs at least 25 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, and the sun occurs about 6 more times. Well, what occurs under the sun? Everything in this dimension, the space-time continuum that we live in, the 5 senses realm. And that is all we see. But there is more to reality than that. Yeah. The spiritual realm also exists in another dimension, and God is over it all. Because we are in this stinky, dirty, and evil world, life can be tough. Ecclesiastes does not hide that fact. And this is why many have the opinion that it is a pessimistic book. One could conclude that if they don't understand the rhythms generated by the repetitions. If they don't discern these, they can miss the whole point of the book and not profit from the great wisdom of the preacher. Here are some statistics. Evil occurs 22 times. good 25 times. Vanity 37 times. Vain once. Fool or foolish 25 times. And finally, wise or wisdom, a whopping 54 times. So, I think we can safely say that this is a book contrasting good and evil and wisdom and foolishness. But is there a greater structure? That usually is the province of phrase repetitions. Are there any of those? Yes. The phrase vanity and vexation of spirit occurs several times in the first half of the book. And it matches the structure that Bullinger documents, because he says that between the introduction and the conclusion, there are two major sections in the book of Ecclesiastes that divide right after the repetitions of vanity and vexation of spirit cease. So they only occur in the first half. And right when they cease, that's where the divide, the split between the first half and the second half is. That fact concerning that repetition lends credence to Bullinger's observation about the structure. He says that after the introduction, which is just chapter 1, verse 1, that from verse 1, chapter 1, verse 2, all the way through chapter 6, verse 9, he says is the chief good what it is not. Then, the rest of the book, chapter 6, verse 10, through chapter 12, verse 12, is the chief good what it is. Then the conclusion is the last two verses in the book. But, as we read through the book, pondering the discussion between good and evil and wisdom and foolishness, we come upon a different and beautiful section that immediately arrests our attention because it has its own rhythm and symmetry, its own repetition, and because of that, it stands out like a diamond in the midst of the first section. Please turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1. Here is the diamond. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to get and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to rend and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love, a time to hate, a time of war, and a time of peace. Isn't that beautiful? By its very nature, it demands to be featured, and it stands out from all the rest. And so by virtue of its own brilliance, it dominates the entire first half of the book of Ecclesiastes. Accordingly, one of the repetitions of the phrase vanity and vexation of spirit is chapter 2, verse 26, right before chapter 3, verse 1, when the diamond starts. So, from that, do you see the beginnings of a structure emerging? Now, of course, we're looking at a translation. More could probably be seen in the Hebrew. Another feature of Ecclesiastes is that Solomon is carrying the reader along with him as he reasons through things. Each new subject is brought up by I gave, or I communed, or I applied, I acquainted, I withheld not, I caused my heart to know or experience. So his heart, my heart, is repeated. Then, the last major repetition in the book is to eat and drink and be joyful, which occurs 5 times. So, here is one way of looking at the structure. So, now this is a simplified structure. My first pass, but I think there are deeper rhythms here than what I have seen, but I'll just show you what I found so far. So, introduction, chapter 1, verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And then verse 2 reads, the preacher declares, vanity of vanities. Now, it repeats that all the way at the end, so there is some symmetry there. And then in the next few verses, Solomon considers all the goings-on in the world, that they're just ceaseless cycles over and over again, and therefore nothing's resolved. And then we have the first repetition of vanity and vexation of spirit in verse 14. He says, I've seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. Then just a few verses later is the next repetition of the same thing. I gave my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is vexation of spirit. Then after that, and the next repetition of vexation of spirit is chapter 2, verse 11. But in between there, he considers mirth and pleasure and laughter and folly and delights and happiness and joy. So those are all about the same kind of thing. And so he considers all those. And then in chapter 2, verse 11, then I looked upon all the works that my hands had wrought, and all the labor that I had labored to do. Behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. So then there is another repetition of that phrase just a few verses later in chapter 2, verse 17. But on the way there, in between, he considers labor and what he had done, realized he couldn't keep it, that he would die, and all those things that he had done, somebody after him would get it. So he said he hated all his labor. And so verse 17, therefore I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me, for it's all vanity and vexation of spirit. That's the 4th repetition. So then the 5th repetition is just a few more verses in verse 21 and 22. And in between there, he talks about the loss of labor. So in chapter 2, verse 21, the last half of that verse is, this also is vanity and a great evil. Verse 22, for that which hath man of all his labor and of the vexation of his heart, wherein he hath labored under the sun. So that's repetition number 5. Now, you notice something about these repetitions. They don't have to be exact copies of one another. All right? In this kind of repetition, just the presence of the components together in the same sentence suffices. All right? That must have sufficed for them. You know, we would think that they would have to be exact. But then we get to the first major conclusion. And that's in chapter 2, verse 24. And he says, there is nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that he should make his soul enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw, that it was from the hand of God. Now, verse 26. Chapter 2, verse 26. For God giveth to a man that is good in his sight, wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner he gives travail to gather and to heap up, that he may give to him that is good before God. This also is vanity and vexation of spirit. So there is the sixth repetition of that phrase. Then, right after that, comes the diamond that we talked about to everything there is a time in chapter 3, verse 1 through 8. But then right after that, the conclusion of to everything has its time is chapter 3, verse 12 and 13. I know that there is no good in them, but for a man to rejoice and to do good in his life, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. You see how the conclusion is a repetition again? Verse 22. Wherefore I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion. For who shall bring him to see what shall be after him? So then, chapter 4, verse 1, he said, I returned and considered oppression and tears and travail and death. So before he considered all the joyful, happy things, now he's considering the opposite. Chapter 4, verse 4, this last half of the verse. This also is vanity and vexation of spirit. Better is a handful with quietness than both hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. Then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. So that is a cluster of those three major components. Vanity, vexation of spirit. Isn't that interesting? And then the next repetition of that is in chapter 4, verse 16. But in between there, it talks about one being alone, but the benefits of having two. Two or better. And then you get to chapter 5, verse 18. Behold, that which I have seen, it is good and comely for one to eat and to drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor that he taketh under the sun all the days of his life, which God giveth him, for it is his portion. Every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and hath given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice of his labor. And it's the gift of God. That is conclusion number 3, and it's a repetition. Now, then the next, vanity and vexation of spirit, which is the last one, the 9th repetition of it, is chapter 6, verse 9. In between there, he talks about desires, and they're meaningless, for someone else could get what you desired for. And now, he ends up, better is the sight of the eyes than the watering of the desire. This also is vanity and vexation of spirit. Now, this ends the first section that Bullinger said was the chief good, what it is not. So now, in the next section, it's going to list the chief good, what it is. And it'll list things that are better and things that are good. Then it lists a whole bunch of miscellaneous proverbs. Now, there might be a structure there. I haven't seen it yet, but it may emerge. Some of you may see between chapter 6, verse 10 and chapter 8, verse 15. There might be some structure there. But in chapter 8, verse 15, we have conclusion number 4. That I commended mirth, because a man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry, for that shall abide with him of his labor the days of his life, which God giveth him under the sun. Isn't that interesting? So then, the next conclusion is chapter 9, verse 7. And in between, it talks about everybody is in the hand of God and everyone's going to die. And since there's nothing one can do after you're dead, you can't do anything. He concludes that we ought to do the following. Chapter 9, verse 7. Go your way, eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart. So there's eat, drink, joy. For now God accepts your works. Let your garments always be white. Let thy head lack no ointment. Live joyfully with the wife whom thou lovest all the days of the life of thy vanity, which he hath given thee under the sun, all the days of thy vanity, for that is thy portion in this life, and in thy labor which thou takest under the sun. This is conclusion number 5. But it adds, in this life, in this life. That definitely implies that there is another life, everlasting life, and that life makes all the difficulties of this life worth it. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It's not all dark and dreary like people think Ecclesiastes is. All right? So we make the best of our trip. Then, in the next part of Ecclesiastes is a bunch of miscellaneous proverbs. Again, there might be a further structure there. I haven't discerned it yet. Then we get to chapter 12. And chapter 12 is an allegory about old age and the grave. It has all kinds of symbols in it about those things. And then it all ends with the words of the preacher, vanity of vanities. And it finally comes to the grand conclusion of it all. Chapter 12, and in verse 13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Reverence God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. So, that's the book of Ecclesiastes. It is not all dark and dreary. It's not all pessimistic because of the reoccurring theme of eat and drink and be joyful. Isn't that interesting? So, could it be true that the conclusion and the action to take, even though life sucks and that we're not in control of our destinies and we're insignificant specks in the universe and mere sparks in the wind of eternity, but because of the repetitions there, we see that Ecclesiastes concludes for us to don't worry, be happy. How simple! Yet that shows God's love and compassion for us, because God wants us to be happy in this life no matter what. Us believers are in his hands, and tell you what, folks, the next life is gonna be super. Yes, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and that light is God and his love and his presence. And he will wash away all the tears of this world. All we need to do is make sure we get there. And we know how to do that by faith in Christ. Isn't that neat? That's something. So, 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 26. We'll finish up. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 26. We're going to return to Solomon in his latter days. Because of his idolatry, God permitted adversaries to arise. 1 Kings 11 lists 3 of them. Hadad the Edomite, Rezin from Syria, and Jeroboam the son of Nebat. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 26. And Jeroboam the son of Nebat, an Ephrathite of Zereda, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow woman, even he lifted up his hand against the king. And this was the cause that he lifted up his hand against the king. Solomon built Millo and repaired the breaches of the city of David, his father. And the man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor. And Solomon, seeing the young man, that he was industrious, he made him ruler over all the charge of the house of Joseph. So the house of Joseph, that's northern Israel, Ephraim and Manasseh. Those were the two strongest tribes in the north. Verse 29. It came to pass at that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, that the prophet Ahaziah the Shilonite found him in the road, in the pathway. And he had clad himself with a new garment, and they two were alone in the field. And Ahijah caught the new garment that was on him and tore it up into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, "You take 10 pieces. For thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and I will give 10 tribes to you. But he shall have 1 tribe for my servant David's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel." Now, why did that happen? Well, the prophet said that this was because of Solomon's idolatry. And if Jeroboam walked righteously, that God would establish his kingdom. Well, when Solomon found out about that, he tried to kill Jeroboam. But Jeroboam escaped and went to Egypt. Chapter 11, verse 40. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam. And Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt, unto Shishak king of Egypt. He was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. And the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? And the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father. And Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his stead. So, let's look at 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 3. When Rehoboam is reigning, they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the congregation of Israel came. And they spake to Rehoboam, saying, "Your father made our yoke grievous. Now therefore make thou the grievous service of thy father and his heavy yoke, which he put upon us, lighter, and we will serve thee." Remember, he had all that building projects, all those buildings and temples and all that, the levies. Chapter 12, verse 5. And Rehoboam said to them, "Depart for 3 days, then come again to me," and the people departed. Verse 6. And King Rehoboam consulted with the old men that stood before Solomon his father while he yet lived, and said, "How do you advise that I answer this people?" And they spake unto him, saying, "If you will be a servant unto this people this day, and will serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever." Sounds like good advice. Verse 8. But he forsook the counsel of the wise men, the old men, which they had given him, and consulted with the young men that were grown up with him, his cronies, which stood before him. And he said unto them, "What counsel do you give, that we may answer this people, who have spoken to me, saying, Make the yoke which my father did put upon us lighter?" And the young men that were grown up with him spoke unto him, saying, "Thus shalt thou speak unto this people that spake unto thee, Thy father made our yoke heavy, but make thou it lighter unto us. Thus shalt thou say to them, My little you-know-what is going to be thicker than my father's loins." Woo! And now whereas my father did lade you with the heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father has chastised you with whips, but I'll chastise you with scorpions. Verse 12. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, as the king had appointed, saying, Come again to me the third day. And the king answered the people roughly, and forsook the old men's counsel that they gave him. Well, that didn't go over very good, did it? All the people left and the kingdom split, and Israel would never rise again to the same heights, except in the future in the millennial kingdom. Chapter 12, verse 17. So the northern 10 tribes split off, but as for the children of Israel which dwelled in the cities of Judah, Rehoboam reigned over them. So Benjamin and Judah remained with Rehoboam. Then King Rehoboam sent to Adoram, who's over the tribute, and Israel stoned him with stones, the tax collector, that he died. Therefore King Rehoboam made speed to get him up to his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel rebelled against the house of David unto this day. It came to pass, when all Israel heard that Jeroboam was come again, he had been in Egypt, then he came back, that they sent and called him unto the congregation and made him king over all Israel, the northern 10 tribes. And there was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. 2 Chronicles 11, verse 1. 2 Chronicles 11, we'll pick it up from Chronicles now. Verse 1. When Rehoboam was come back to Jerusalem, he gathered the house of Judah and Benjamin, 180,000 chosen men that were warriors to fight against Israel, that he might bring the kingdom again to himself. But the word of the Lord came to Shemaiah, the man of God, saying, Speak unto Rehoboam the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all Israel and Judah and Benjamin, saying, Thus saith the Lord, you shall not go up, nor fight against your brethren. Return every man to his house, for this thing is done of me. And they obeyed the words of the Lord and returned from going against Jeroboam. So, for a while, Rehoboam ruled righteously. 2 Chronicles 11:5. Rehoboam dwelt in Jerusalem, built cities of defense in Judah. Verse 12. And in every several city put up shields and spears, made them exceeding strong, having Judah and Benjamin on his side. Verse 13. And the priests and Levites that were in all Israel resorted to him out of all their coasts. So all the priests and the Levites that were up in the northern 10 tribes area left and came south. Why did that happen? We'll tell you in a minute. For the Levites left their suburbs in their possession. They came, Judah and Jerusalem, for Jeroboam and his sons had cast them off from executing the priest's office unto the Lord. Jeroboam fired them. Verse 15, and Jeroboam he ordained and put him priests for the high places and for the devils and for the calves that he had made. I'll tell you about that in a moment. And after them out of all the tribes of Israel, such as set their hearts to seek the Lord God of Israel, came to Jerusalem to sacrifice unto the Lord God of their fathers. So the believers that still wanted to go south to sacrifice at the temple went there no matter what Jeroboam said. Verse 17. So they strengthened the kingdoms of Judah and made Rehoboam the son of Solomon strong for 3 years. And for 3 years they walked in the way of David and Solomon. So for 3 years Rehoboam did right in the sight of the Lord. Well, finally we're going to end up in 1 Kings chapter 12. 1 Kings chapter 12. We're going to find out why all those people came south from the northern kingdom. 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 26. Jeroboam said in his heart, now shall the kingdom return to the house of David if this people go up to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem. Then shall the heart of this people turn again unto their Lord, even unto Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they all kill me, and go again to Rehoboam, king of Judah. Well, is that what the prophet told him? I mean, he had become king of the northern 10 tribes, just like the prophet had torn 10 pieces of his garment and gave it to him. So why wouldn't he believe the rest? That if he was righteous, God would establish his kingdom. Well, he didn't believe it. Verse 28. Whereupon King Jeroboam took counsel and made 2 calves of gold and said to them, it's too much for you to go all the way down to Jerusalem. Behold, your gods, O Israel, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt. What? And he set one in Bethel, and the other put he in Dan, one in the south part of the 10 tribe area, and one in the north. And this thing became a sin. It was called the sin of Jeroboam. For the people went to worship before the one, even to Dan. And he made a house of high places, and made priests of the lowest of the people. Nobody wanted to take that job, and so he took anyone that would do it. And he took the lowest of the people, which were willing to do it, which were not of the sons of Levi. Verse 32. And Jeroboam ordained a feast, his own homemade feast, in the 8th month on the 15th day of the month, like unto the feast that's in Judah. And he offered upon the altar. So did he in Bethel, sacrificing unto the calves that he had made, and he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places that he had made. So he offered upon the altar which he had made in Bethel the 15th day of the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised of his own heart, and ordained a feast unto the children of Israel, and he offered upon the altar and burnt incense. So he figured that if everybody from Israel kept going down south to the temple, that ultimately the Rehoboam and the kingdom down there would win their hearts, and they would want to become part of that again, and they would kill Jeroboam. So he set up this altar as a competing religion to keep everybody home. And so he's dedicating his altar for the first time in chapter 13 of 1 Kings, verse 1. And behold, there came a man of God out of Judah by the word of the Lord to Bethel, and Jeroboam stood by the altar to burn incense. And this prophet cried against the altar in the word of the Lord and said, Oh, altar, altar, thus saith the Lord, behold, a child shall be born in the house of David, Josiah by name. And upon thee shall he offer the priests of the high places that burn incense upon thee, and men's bones shall be burnt upon thee. So these altars are going to be desecrated by Josiah by name. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, This is the sign which the Lord hath spoken. Behold, the altar shall be rent, and the ashes that are upon it shall be poured out. Well, guess what? Hundreds of years later, Josiah, the king, did exactly what this prophet said. Chapter 13, verse 4. And it came to pass, when King Jeroboam heard the saying of the man of God, which cried against the altar, he put forth his hand from the altar and say, You get that man, lay hold on him. And his hand, which he put forth against him, dried up, so he couldn't pull it again to him. Ooh. And the altar was rent. They didn't temper the brass right, and the heat caused it to bust right then. It cracked open, and ashes poured out from the altar, according to the sign which the man had given by the word of the Lord. Verse 6. And the king answered and said to the man of God, Entreat now the face of the Lord thy God and pray for me, that my hand may be restored me again? And the man of God besought the Lord, and the king's hand was restored unto him again, and it became as it was before. Wow! Did Jeroboam change after that? No, he did not. And what he did had become known as the sin of Jeroboam, setting up those 2 pagan altars, and that sin adversely affected the northern kingdom such that every king did evil in the sight of the Lord from that point on. And things got worse and worse until Moses' prophecy, which we read from Deuteronomy 29, came to pass. And the Assyrians conquered the northern 10 tribes and carried them off and scattered them all across the Levant, and they were assimilated into the populace, so that now the only way to find them is with 23andMe DNA testing. Except for some of the 10 tribes which had migrated in the other direction, because Israel was a seafaring nation, and so there were still enclaves of the 10 tribes existing all around the Mediterranean. And tonight, listening, we have one of them from the tribe of Asher, Peter Arbib. His relatives are from the tribe of Asher, which migrated to Libya before the northern 10 tribes got wiped out. Well, praise God. So that's session 7A. Bless you.